Working with a sponge, try to make sure that it always stays damp. While your sponge is damp, you'll have an easier time applying even layers of paint onto the model. At least that's what I found from my personal experience. If I want to do a lot of layers and have a much smoother transition, you want to work much more wet and essentially have thinner layers as a result. The only issue with that is you'll have a lot more time drying between each layer. Don't feel limited by the size of your sponge, adjust it to your needs. Try to think of every single model as a cylinder. You're just applying the sponge through the cylinder where the light will be hitting. There is one exception. When you're applying your final highlights, you actually want to go further into the shadows. You're edge highlighting all the little areas where the light will be catching. That's optional. It will create a bit more detail to your model and make it much more visually clear as to where the line begins and another line ends, but it's not necessary when you're painting an army. It's my personal approach. It's definitely not the best, and it's just the concept I applied to the specific model. Here's the list of all the products I've used. I didn't have the exact Sons of Horus colors, so I had to mix my own from the emerald green. I never actually used emerald green on its own as it's far too saturated and just not the type of color I was looking for. I got it by mixing emerald green with white and black to desaturate it and then bring the brightness back, and also mixing it with just ice yellow by itself to create the final highlights. I grabbed my base color and tried to go over the entire model. I made sure my sponge was nice and damp, and I tried to cover every single detail. I wasn't too worried if some of the details were left unsponged, as later on I'd be going in with Streaking Grime and it would cover up any of the minor details that I've left unpainted. I'm not particularly careful with this step as this is the base color and it just doesn't really matter. All I'm trying to do is cover as much area, so I'm rotating the model at every single angle I possibly can get it in and just sponging in every single area. I'm applying moderate pressure to make sure that enough paint actually gets out. Once the model is dry, I move on to my next color. This is essentially a mix between my blend and my mid-tone. I'm applying the exact same technique, which is working quite wet and just sponging it all. This time, I'm not rotating the model as much and I'm not using as much force. By doing this, I'm hoping to leave a lot of the base colors still visible, but introduce a lot of this gradient detail that will provide a smoother transition to all the other colors. An important thing to keep in mind is, even though this is a very dark color, while the paint is wet, it'll appear much brighter than it's going to be, especially if you're working in a thinner layer by using a lot more water. I move into my mid-tone and I grab a pair of tweezers and a smaller sponge. This way it'll be much easier for me to hold the sponge, and as the sponge is much smaller, it'll be much more precise. I start off by dabbing just very small amounts of paint as I thought the color was a little bit too bright and it would be a bit of a harsh transition. So I applied a very tiny amount just to see if the result was something I liked. I waited for the small amount to dry, and once I was satisfied with the result, I continued dabbing it on the rest of the model. Once again, I'm working even more wet, just so that the transition between the paints is much more smooth and doesn't leave behind much of the texture of the sponge. For the shoulders, I'm painting them edge upwards, so I'm trying to cover as much of the edge while leaving a lot of the areas closer to where the gold is going to be. For every other area, I'm trying to hold the sponge and apply it from above downwards. That way, I'm able to leave a lot of the shadow areas between where the plates are going to be. I'm not rushing in any way. I'm taking my time and just carefully trying to decide where I'm going to apply it, as I wasn't even certain where the highlights were going to be at the moment. By using a sponge from above and pointing it downwards, I was able to use the natural shape of the model as a guide for where my colors were going to be. I moved on to what I thought was going to be my final highlight, and I started applying it to the upmost edges of the shoulder pads. The reason I'm saying what I thought was going to be my final highlight is once I applied it, I realized it was far too desaturated and pale. So the model just looked a bit dead, and it didn't really have enough life in it to provide an interesting visual variation between the colors I've previously applied. Nonetheless, I continued with this color, applying it to all the edges where I wanted my highlights to be, which is using very light pressure and just lightly allowing the sponge to settle on the edges and give me that edge highlighted look without allowing the sponge to go into the deeper areas. I finally added a lot more ice yellow to my color to bring the warmth back into the color. Since all the other colors look extremely cold, using a very bright and warm color will bring out the transition of the color from the cold to the warm, as if the sunlight is hitting the model and warming up those highlights. You're essentially creating a contrast between not just dark and light, but also cold and warm, tricking the eye that there's actually more work done to the model than there actually is. Here I grab my hull red and apply it to the model's leather parts. I want it to be a single color, nothing else. This is meant to be just simple, so I grabbed the color that would be bright, but also not too dark, sort of an in-between, as I was gonna allow the Streaking Grime to apply the shadows to it. I painted all the weapon parts black. I considered adding a metallic, but I knew that would just add extra steps and a lot more time. Once I mixed up my gold by combining Vallejo metal color gold and Green Stuff World's antique gold, I was able to apply it in one simple layer. The color is very vibrant, so I wasn't too worried that once the Streaking Grime was going to go on top of it, it was going to kill it too much. Plus the fact that it's very warm while the rest of the armor is quite cold, it provides great contrast, so even once it becomes desaturated, it's still very visible and easily recognizable as gold. I continued applying it to all of the panels. I made sure I picked up the panels that would be easy to paint. I did ignore a few of them purposefully, as that would just add a lot more time and a lot more steps that, once again, if you're painting an army, you want to take out as much extra steps as possible to make it easier for yourself in the long run. For a moment, I did consider not painting the head visor gold, as it's a lot more detail oriented and that would just be much more difficult, but it provided a lot of visual interest by having the gold there, essentially creating a break point for where the armor is and where the gold is, making the head slot a lot more visible than it otherwise would have been. For example, on a Primaris model, it would have red lenses, so I would prioritize that over the gold trim on the helmet. With a metallic, you definitely want to take your time, as any mistakes will definitely be more costly than previous colors. Once that was done, I looked over my model and it was basically good to go. You could realistically just stop right here and have a fantastic model. However, I had my mind settled on using Streaking Grime from the beginning, so I grabbed the Streaking Grime for Panzer Grey and applied it to the entire model. I tried to cover as much of the model as possible in it, but at the same time, I'm not going back for a lot of extra Streaking Grime. I'm just trying to drag the Streaking Grime I already have. I didn't varnish the model or anything like that, as I didn't feel there was a need for it, as my layers were quite thick and they weren't just as fragile as if you were doing a much cleaner, more thinner transition between the layers. I grabbed a sponge to essentially clean off the excess. In certain areas, there's a lot of Streaking Grime that just gathers, and even though it looks quite dry, it's still quite wet, so you would just be dragging that along as you were trying to clean it off. So this helps to make sure that once you grab the odorless thinner, you have a much easier time with it. I took my Q-tip covered in odorless thinner and just started cleaning up the model. I'm trying my best to clean all of the surfaces, but at the same time, I'm not pushing the Q-tip in. Also, when working with the Q-tip, you want to be careful, as it does leave those fibers behind, so I occasionally try to roll it, and when I see that it's starting to fiber up too much, I consider switching it up. In this case, I got pretty lucky, and just using a single Q-tip worked out pretty well for me. I'm dragging the Q-tip from above downwards. That way I'm able to use the natural shape of the armor to essentially provide a guide for where the shadows are going to be. This makes it much easier for me, and I don't have to put extra thought into where should the shadows actually be on the model. This applies essentially to every other model that you'd apply Streaking Grime to. You're using the natural shape of the model to guide you for where it's going to be. I grab a sponge to essentially polish the Streaking Grime. It filters it out by not having these harsh transitions for where the Streaking Grime is and where the Streaking Grime isn't, but I'm also, once again, using the model as a guide for where I'm swiping. When using Streaking Grime, try to avoid having excess of it applying to your hands, as it is technically toxic, and you want to make sure you wash your hands thoroughly afterwards. Try to make sure you also do not leave the Streaking Grime or the odorless thinner open. Once you're done using them and you've applied them to your sponge or your brush, or in this case the Q-tip, you want to close it. In this step, I once again grabbed the Q-tip covered in odorless thinner and I started to clean up most edges. This way I'm able to bring back that saturated color that I would use for the highlights and bring back some of the vibrancy of the color as well, as Streaking Grime has a tendency to essentially kill the vibrancy of the model as it's applying this dark filter across all of it, even though it seems like you've cleaned most of it off. By this point, I'm essentially almost done, and before I base the model, I varnish it just to make sure it doesn't have any of that Streaking Grime still on the surface. It does have also a slightly unpleasant smell, so by varnishing, you're making sure it doesn't leave any of that either. I grabbed my basing texture and just applied it to the entire base. Try to be careful when applying it so you don't accidentally grab that texture and place it on top of the model, as it'll be quite a bit difficult to cleaning it off. I put a nice tuff in the model just to have some more interest in the base so it's not just boring as just some mud and ground. Then I grab some dry pigment and apply it to the model as if the ground is dusty and is slowly collecting onto the legs. This helps connect the model to the base so that they feel as if they're in one world. I hope some of you found this helpful, and if you got any questions, feel free to ask. I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching and have a good day.